It's the £10 million question, or should that be the slightly more than £10 million question? Does Daniel Ricciardo owe former advisor Glenn Beavis just over £10 million connected to his current Renault deal? I'm joined by Scott Mitchell to delve into the evidence that's so far been presented in this case to try and get an understanding for who is claiming what. Well, Scott, what's the sort of broad overview of the sort of top line claims here?
So basically, Glenn Beavis, through the company that he set up, that he owns to manage or to provide management services to Ricciardo, and that he through his company is claiming that he's owed this plus £10 million figure, which he claims relates to 20% of the commission. Effectively, it's a 20% commission of Ricciardo's base Renault salary and some ancillary bits and bobs around that, including future fees from performance clauses that haven't yet been met, that sort of thing. He claims he's owed all of this. The two defendants in the case are Ricciardo himself personally and the company White Dunes that Ricciardo set up to basically manage his affairs, and that's basically Ricciardo, his parents, and a close family friend. So that's sort of the broad outline of what's going on. Beavis lodged a claim with London's High Court of Justice, alleging that he was owed all of this money and seeking to establish the fact that he has the entitlement to future fees as well. And now we've had Ricciardo's and his formal response from his representatives. That's also been lodged to the High Court. We've seen these documents. They're quite intense and unsurprisingly quite detailed, especially the defence, which Ricciardo made it very, very clear to us that he was going to defend rigorously through the court. We don't quite know sort of what the next stage is. Obviously, it will be looked at to establish, right, what happens next. Is there a claim? Does this go to a trial? But yeah, we've got the firm foundations of what both sides are claiming now out on the table.
I should say I've seen Scott Mitchell studying this documentation. It's not just been glancing through it, it's been a very, very rigorous investigation. So when it comes down to the detail, what you've described there is kind of a standard management deal with a certain percentage, etc. But obviously the devil is in the detail, and what we've seen in this documentation lays out very clearly what Glenn Beavis says was the agreement and should happen, and then what Daniel Ricciardo and his people say had happened. So what are the kind of the individual areas that are being tackled in this dispute? Okay,
I'll try and be succinct. As Ed points out, it's been quite a long process. There's a lot to go through. So basically what it boils down to is the fact that Beavis and Ricciardo worked together from 2012 through to the start of this year. Ricciardo,
and he's the guy who turned up in the Netflix documentary.
Yeah, so you might have seen him. I think he's a slightly not got much hair, less hair than you, I think. But he's a Netflix star and you're not. Basically, he had this agreement in place with Ricciardo. Started in 2012, and then there was a new agreement in place from mid 2015.
So 2012 is when Ricciardo came into Formula One full time, shall we say, after his brief half season with HRT.
Exactly, and then by 2015, obviously he's an established race winner with Red Bull, and seeking to sort of boost his value. And obviously, as we know, since then has become one of the established leading stars of Formula One. But he has moved to a proper agency now, formal representation for the first time in his career. Beavis was employed as an advisor, obviously he takes advice from his mum and dad and his close friend as well. So basically, the way that what they established is that Beavis would work and then be paid a monthly retainer. Beavis claims that the agreement that has been in place since 2015 established that he would have a 20% commission on top of his fixed monthly retainer of $20,000. But Ricciardo and his representatives claim that that's not true. There was never any agreement of a 20% commission. They would only ever agreed the retainer and then ad hoc payments. And the two key things for me from everything that has come out from Ricciardo's defence are that, first of all, Ricciardo and his representatives are absolutely adamant that there was never any agreement for a commission. They also claim that that Beavis never expressed any entitlement to a commission until after the agreement was terminated in March of this year. That's when Beavis basically wrapped up all of the stuff that he was doing for Ricciardo during a handover period after Ricciardo told him in December last year that he didn't want the agreement to continue. So that's the main thing, there's this clear disagreement over whether there was any kind of formal or otherwise promise or entitlement for Beavis to have the 20%. So that's the first thing that's come from it. The second thing I think that's really important that's come from it is that Ricciardo basically has made it clear that he expressed that in principle he would be open to the idea of 20% on an ad hoc basis on commercial and sponsorship deals.
So these are all the little side deals that are constantly happening for drivers' personal deals, not necessarily the overall payment.
Exactly, and there's an example of this where Ricciardo did pay Beavis 20% commission on a deal that he introduced because the deal was done. I think it was with a healthcare sponsorship deal, and Beavis introduced it, and then he requested that he get 20% commission, and Ricciardo said, "Yeah, actually, you know what? I'm fine with that. Here you go. Here's your 20% commission." But Ricciardo states that this was a specific case where it was requested and done individually, and this goes back to a conversation that took place in 2015 when Ricciardo and his representatives admit that there was a conversation between Beavis and Ricciardo where the 20% commission was floated, and it was brought up in conversation and discussed as a notion for, I don't know if it was for the first time, but it was certainly, it is acknowledged that occurred. However, Ricciardo claims that all he did was note that in principle he would be open to that idea. He didn't indicate that he wanted there to be any legally binding element to this. He didn't indicate that was going to happen. Whereas Beavis claims that was one of the moments where he was given assurances from Ricciardo or his camp that there would be a 20% commission in place. And the other thing from that is that Ricciardo claims that was again just in terms of a commercial or sponsorship opportunity. At no point, this is really, really emphatic with this throughout the defence, that at no point was Beavis ever entitled to 20% of Ricciardo's racing earnings.
But of course we should say the Beavis side of this will attempt, if this comes to a full-blown trial, will attempt to prove that, obviously, and there will be documentation, ideally, that would do this. So what we know from reading through this documentation is there was a clear partnership going on there, so there's no doubt about that, but it's the detail of what was explicitly agreed between the two that is being disputed, shall we say.
It's the terms, exactly. So they'd worked together for more than 6 seasons. Beavis did play a part in getting the Renault deal done, but Ricciardo, the counterclaim is that Beavis was not responsible for instigating the deal. We didn't introduce the deal, and he didn't introduce the idea of switching teams either. They say that Beavis invoiced as appropriate for the role that he played. He was paid his $20,000 because he performed his management services. That's the Ricciardo defence claim, whereas what Beavis asserts is that he used his contacts with Cyril Abiteboul to start the move to Renault process as early as mid-2017, a year before it actually happened, or a year before the initial deal was done. So there's this there's this huge clash of detail. It's astonishing how far apart the two versions of events are when you consider, because
that's the nature of this, though, isn't it? Because inevitably you've got somebody making a claim, so they will throw everything at it, and somebody making a defence, so they will throw everything at it in a more favourable light. So it's where the kind of dial of truth comes down between them, if it does get to a court situation.
To a point, but often I find that with legal stuff like this, it comes down to nuance and fine details. But they're so far apart on certain things. We're not putting words in anyone's mouth or saying that this is broadly what they're claiming. But what it boils down to is that Beavis claiming I am owed 20% commission. We had a deal that said I would get 20% commission, and the Ricciardo defence is at no point was it requested formally or established formally. And there's lots and lots of little bits of detail in the Beavis claim that Ricciardo and his representatives are disputing quite strongly, whether like a telephone call even happened, slamming the claim for being vague and embarrassing for, that's a quote, that's not them, my words. Vague and embarrassing is the term that's used 3 times in the Ricciardo defence. So you're right, they've thrown everything at this. Beavis's claim was very, very detailed. Ricciardo's defence is perhaps even more detailed, as defences generally are, but we've got to wait and see what comes out in the wash now, because it's going to be down to the 2 parties to provide more evidence. There's been a lot of evidence, initial evidence presented from Ricciardo's side, email excerpts and things like that make that make a very strong case, in their opinion, that there's no evidence of a 20% commission, and in fact they've provided some evidence to the contrary that if emphatically rules out that a 20% commission or any kind of percentage of Ricciardo's earnings can be used.
So what happens now? What's the next step in this? We've heard Beavis's claim. We've heard Daniel Ricciardo's side's response to it. What next?
Well, we wait and see to determine whether or not how it basically proceeds from here. I think it needs to be looked at. It needs to be established whether or not there is a legitimate claim there, and then it will be dealt with by the High Court in the appropriate manner. Ricciardo has already made it really clear that he's going to defend this really aggressively through the court process, and that means that if it means going to a courtroom, then that's what Ricciardo and his representatives will do to prove it. But there is a burden of proof. There needs to be more evidence, basically, for there to be a verdict on Beavis's side, because obviously plus £10 million is a huge amount of money. I don't think it's over by a long way. Obviously, the effort that Beavis has gone to make this claim is not an insignificant sum of money, so he's chasing it for a reason. He genuinely believes, obviously, that he's owed it. And Ricciardo's fighting back on the legal side with as much firepower as they can muster. So it doesn't look like either side's going to yield. So now it comes down to sort of what happens with the legal process.
Now, in the bigger picture, we should say that a little bit of mathematics here. This is a 2-year deal for Daniel Ricciardo. 20% of his Renault pay is the claim, and the claim is a little bit over 10 million. So while there's various details redacted in the information that's been released so far, we can infer from that roughly what ballpark Daniel Ricciardo's Renault deal is in terms of the value.
Yeah, you're looking at a salary of around £20 million. Because, simple mathematics, isn't it? It's more slightly. Beavis is claiming just over £10 million total. So that's 20%. So times that by 5, that's around £50 million. That won't just be the base salary. There'll be other bits and bobs around that. So it's not like we're saying that Ricciardo's earning £25 million a year or anything like that. But the fixed fee that he's going after is over 2 years. So that's going to be roughly £20 million, maybe a bit more a season, which is a massive amount of money, especially to pay someone who's going to be finishing 6th or 7th a lot, and probably won't finish higher than 7th in the Drivers' Championship. But that's a separate issue entirely.
It tells us how much Renault has committed into getting Daniel Ricciardo, who's a wonderful driver, but they've really committed, and they are at a point where basically they're in a fight for their lives, really, to try and take 4th place in the constructors, which is a real tough ask.
And there are other details that, you're right, we don't have specific numbers a lot of the time in this document. It's been made confidential in the interest of keeping Ricciardo's commercial interests confidential. But there are specific references to clauses in the contract. So some of them are things that you might expect. So his cost of his super license is covered. We know that. Gets a personal car from the company. Fair enough. There's a couple more slightly interesting ones. Obviously, we know that there's a proper end of season bonus in there. We know there's a win bonus in there at the moment.
I'm not sure the win bonus will be called on.
Renault seem quite safe from that. But there was a clause in the original claim. The clause was redacted in full. Or there were 2 that were redacted in full, I believe. One which hasn't been elaborated on by the defence, but has been referred to in the defence's counterclaim as they deny that it's unusual. So that sort of piqued my interest. I was like, okay, so Beavis has obviously claimed that something in there is unusual. Don't really know what that is. But the other one, again, which wasn't referenced in the claim because of the confidentiality, is explicitly referenced in the defence, where they admit that Ricciardo's contract includes the provision of the winning car should he win a race, so minus engine and gearbox. So Ricciardo gets a Renault basically if he wins. But they massively dispute the claim, whatever value Beavis claims that car's worth, which is obviously his money that he's claiming, because that's how the 20% commission works. This is where the other little bits and bobs come from on top of the base salary. Beavis has put a financial sum to the value of elements of the deal that Ricciardo is covered, that Renault pays for. So Beavis is saying, well, I'm owed 20% of that. If your super license costs X amount of pounds a year, then I'm owed 20% of that because you don't have to pay it, therefore that's mine. He's claiming for all of these things. And yeah, the winning car is one of them. But yeah, so on the Ricciardo side, they've admitted that that's in the contract, which we didn't know originally. But they've said your value of this is way off. You need to prove why this is the case. So they're sort of really starting to turn the screw on the defence side.
Well, this is a process that is ongoing, so I'm sure there'll be more about this in the future. But also it's fascinating to get a little bit of a glimpse into some of the details that we don't normally get about a driver's contract, particularly when it's a big deal like Daniel Ricciardo's.